Hello, everyone. Thank you to all the participants joining us today for this expert roundtable on the future of the peace process in Ukraine. Today's event will be held in English and will have Ukrainian interpretation. Please select the language that is most appropriate for you at the bottom of the screen. My name is Milena Sterio, and I'm the Managing Director at the Public International Law and Policy Group, and also a chaired professor of law at Cleveland State University. I will be moderating today's discussion, and I'm honored to be guiding this conversation with all of our experts. The Public International Law and Policy Group is a global pro bono law firm providing free legal assistance to parties involved in peace negotiations, post-conflict constitutions, and atrocity crimes prosecution. This roundtable is part of PILPG's Thought Leadership Initiative. This initiative aims to share expertise and reflections from our work by organizing periodic roundtables on a range of topics, from prominent international law issues to pressing global conflicts. Over the past couple of months, Ukraine has become the main headline around the globe. On February 24th, 2022, Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which has thus far led to thousands of civilian deaths and massive destruction of Ukrainian cities, including areas around the capital, Kyiv. In response to these actions and the contravention of core international legal principles, the international community has imposed fierce sanctions targeting every sector of the Russian economy. NATO has also taken steps to bolster its defense in Eastern Europe. With the fragmented state of the Russian military operation in Ukraine, both sides have begun to engage in rounds of peace negotiations. However, there has been little breakthrough. During today's event, we will be discussing the recent developments in the Russian invasion of Ukraine, talk through potential legal and policy options for peace moving forward, and provide insight to the essential elements needed to negotiate peace in Ukraine. The roundtable will be 60 minutes long. Our distinguished panelists include Ambassador Sven Alkalai, Victor Rudd, Dr. Bohdan Vivitsky, and Dr. Paul Williams. Today's event will be recorded and subsequently posted on our website. We ask that you please submit any questions you may have for our speakers using the Q&A function, and we will do our best to answer your questions at the end of this event. Now, please allow me just a few minutes to introduce our panelists. We're excited to welcome Ambassador Sven Alkalai, a Bosnian diplomat who currently serves as the permanent representative of Bosnia and Herzegovina to the United Nations. During the time of conflict in the former Yugoslavia, Ambassador Alkalai served as Bosnia's first ambassador to the United States. During his diplomatic career, Ambassador Alkalai served as Undersecretary General and Executive Secretary at the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe. He also served as his country's Minister of Foreign Affairs between 2007 and 2012, and as Bosnia and Herzegovina's ambassador to Belgium and NATO, as well as Luxembourg from 2004 to 2007. Most recently, Ambassador Alkalai served as visiting professor at the Geneva School of Diplomacy and International Relations in Switzerland, as well as assistant professor at the University of Travnik in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Joining us today is also Victor Rudd. Mr. Rudd has practiced law for 40 years, and before the fall of the Soviet Union, represented political prisoners persecuted by the KGB. Mr. Rudd has spoken both domestically and internationally on issues affecting the United States, Russia, and Ukraine relations, and his commentary has been published by Forbes, EU Today, Center for European Policy Analysis, and the Kyiv Post, among many others. Mr. Rudd also served as chairman of the Ukrainian American Bar Association and currently chairs its Committee on Foreign Affairs. I'm also honored to welcome Dr. Bohdan Vivitsky, who retired from the United States Justice Department in 2014. From 2007 to 2009, he served as a resident legal advisor at the US Embassy in Ukraine. In 2016, at the request of Ukrainian President Poroshenko to Vice President Biden, he returned to Ukraine to serve as special advisor to Ukraine's Prosecutor General. He has written and lectured extensively on topics related to the rule of law and corruption reduction in both Ukraine and North America, and has long been active in the Ukrainian American community life. And finally, we have Dr. Paul Williams. As a world-renowned peace negotiation lawyer, Dr. Williams has assisted over 2,000 parties in major international peace negotiations and has advised numerous parties on the drafting and implementation of post-conflict constitutions. Dr. Williams is a sought-after international law and policy expert and has authored 9 books on various topics concerning international law. He holds the Rebecca I. Grazier Professorship in Law and International Relations at American University, where he teaches in the School of International Service, and he's also the co-founder and president of the Public International Law and Policy Group. For full speaker biographies, please see the link sent in the Zoom chat and visit the PILPG website. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for agreeing to participate in today's panel. To begin, my first question is for Victor. Victor, we know that peace negotiations thus far have not been successful. More critically, what is fundamentally at issue in Russia's war against Ukraine, and how does that impact prospects for a negotiated resolution?
Yes, thank you very much for the question and for the invitation, of course. Thanks to all the organizers and indeed to our audience. The issue that we have on the table is much more than simply competing claims by 2 combatants, each one with a position, and then you engage in some sort of horse trading during negotiations and you come to hopefully an agreement. It goes far, far beyond that. Putin has been very, very clear for many years that he is warring against the entirety of the work product of the 20th century and everything that was constructed after World War II in particular, with the United States in the lead being what we sometimes called a little bit grandiosely the rules-based international order. So what's on the table on the one hand is a war against the very concept of what we're talking about, the very concept of peace agreements, and call it a peace agreement, a treaty, or anything else, but they are all rooted in the UN Charter, Helsinki Accords, and everything else after that. So we have that anomaly right from the get-go that the war itself is conceptually much more broader than against Ukraine itself. And Ukraine, of course, is the canary in the coal mine. But the issue as far as Ukraine is concerned goes beyond the traditional territorial issues that invaders typically impose. Russia, as we know, is the largest country in Europe. 40% of Russia is Europe, and the other 60% is 1/3 of Asia. So you can get a sense of the size of Russia. Ukraine is less than 3%. Russia does not need Ukraine for any kind of territorial purposes. The territory component really is as a springboard and a tool for subversion. And you can ask, well, to what end? Well, it's being articulated, it has been articulated previously by Putin, and even more so now, not just by him, but other spokesmen, including from the state-controlled media. And that is that not only does Ukraine not have the right to exist as a sovereign nation, but that in fact, it doesn't exist. It never existed. And that is a fairly unique assertion in the course of the history of international relations and aggression. And genocide itself, the term itself, is increasingly used in the Russian-sponsored media. Textbooks in Russia are being modified to eliminate any mention of the word Ukraine or even Kyiv. In Ukraine, as we know, schools, museums, libraries, cultural institutions are being specifically targeted and destroyed. And you can ask yourself the question, well, why are children being removed from Ukraine to Russia, together with deportations of adults? And it all goes to the point of changing the ultimately the ethnographic composition and indeed the national ethos of Ukraine into ultimately a non-nation, which is the way Putin sees it. So against that background, of course, it's a legitimate and a necessary threshold question. What are the prospects for any kind of peaceful diplomatic resolution of that, even something as relatively modest as a ceasefire? And I have to tell you very honestly right now, I am not sanguine. Golda Meir, who we may remember, those who were around and even those who were not at the time in the late 60s, early 70s, Golda Meir was the prime minister of Israel. She was born incidentally in Kyiv. And she summarized the existential question for Israel as they want to kill us, we want to leave. That's not something you negotiate. So that is the overarching problem with moving forward along these lines. But even from the standpoint of process and procedure, I think we should remain aware of at least two components. Number one, for us, our national DNA, our cultural DNA, politically, mercantile, and everything else is grounded on the notion of an agreement. If you have a disagreement, if you have a dispute, if you reach an agreement, you have resolved it. That's in our psyche. An agreement means resolution. That for Russia has never, ever been the case. Negotiation is perceived as weakness, and an agreement, no matter what the subject matter is, an agreement is for the purpose, for Russia at least, it's for the purpose of either subverting the realization of the purpose of the agreement, achieving the very opposite of the purpose of the agreement, or simply stalling and buying time to recoup an advantage tactically on the ground. That's point number one. Point number two, I think it'd be very helpful if we address in the course of this panel, if we have the opportunity, a very fundamental issue of enforcement. How would any agreement, no matter what it encompasses, how would enforcement ever be realized? Because as I said at the very beginning, the entirety of the global structure that we're dealing with and that has been trashed by Russia really centers around the inviolability of borders, national sovereignty, and ultimately peace. So that is in a very summary fashion, my thoughts on it. I'll be happy to obviously to pick up questions in the chat column or whatever we have here.
Thank you so much, Victor. To follow up, the next question is for Bohdan. You recently wrote about how history has been weaponized in order to justify the invasion of Ukraine. What can you tell us about the drivers of the Russian attack on Ukraine?
Sure, thank you. With respect to historical background, in 1863, and I emphasize 1863, the Tsarist Russian Minister of the Interior, Petro Valuyev, issued a circular that banned the publication of books in the Ukrainian language in the Russian Empire. About 3/4 of today's Ukraine had then been absorbed into that empire. And along with that ban, Valuyev declared famously that the Ukrainian language, to which he contemptuously referred to as Little Russian, had not existed, did not then exist, and will not exist. Clearly, these were not factual statements, insofar as if they had been, there would be no need for a ban. So this was instead a statement of cultural genocidal intent and a harbinger of much worse to come. Fast forward 159 years to this last year, and we have the long July 2021 article about Ukraine and Ukrainians under President Vladimir Putin's name, the very recent April 3rd article in RIA Novosti, the semi-official Moscow press outlet, which article Timothy Snyder called the blueprint for genocide, the Dmitry Medvedev article, and others, all of which contain the bizarre claims that Ukraine isn't actually real, that it isn't legitimate, that Ukrainians who think they are Ukrainians are actually Nazis, and that Ukrainians have somehow been misled into misunderstanding that they really aren't Ukrainians, and so on. In between the 1863 ban and today's invasion, various Russian armies, the Tsarist Russian army, the Bolshevik Russian armies, the anti-Bolshevik white Russian army have all invaded and occupied Ukraine. They have killed millions of Ukrainians. including the Holodomor, during the Holodomor of 1932-33, and they have sent other millions to the Gulag. Now, a tale of two poets may be instructive here to further illuminate the historical context behind Russia's actions. Vasily Stus is one of Ukraine's greatest 20th century poets. He was nominated in 1985 for a Nobel Prize, but he died in a Soviet concentration camp that same year, just 37 years ago. His crime? Writing patriotic Ukrainian poetry. On the other hand, his contemporary, the Russian poet Joseph Brodsky, a purported liberal, came to the United States from Russia in 1977. He taught at Yale, Columbia, Cambridge, and Michigan, and he won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1987. In 1992, right after Ukraine's independence, Brodsky wrote a vicious anti-Ukrainian poem titled On Ukrainian Independence, in which he wished, and I'm quoting his language, he wished upon Ukrainians that they be gang-raped by Germans and Poles. He said that he wished to spit in the Dnipro River to make it flow backwards. And he wrote that on their deathbeds, Ukrainians would not recall the bullshit of their national poet, Taras Shevchenko, but would recite the lines of real poetry from the Russian poet Alexander Pushkin. Russian attitudes towards Ukrainians are analogous to the attitudes of white supremacists towards American Blacks. Russians have for centuries demonstrated some variation of hatred and contempt towards Ukrainians. And now they also deeply resent that today's Ukraine is actually a democracy, that it has a free press and an active civil society. So they want to destroy it. This then is the very, very challenging historical legacy behind Russia's current invasion and assault upon Ukraine.
Thank you. We will definitely return to some of these themes later on in the roundtable. Now, let me turn to Paul next. Paul, fast forward to today, and what are some key issues that need to be negotiated between Ukraine and Russia in order to at least attempt to achieve a peaceful resolution to this conflict?
Thank you, Milena. I think when seeking to answer that question, you have to keep in mind Victor's initial observation that this isn't a traditional peace negotiation, the ones that we've seen over the last 30 years. This is straight up territorial aggression. And I'll move in a second into some of the issues that will be on the table. But I think the overall arc, and Sven might be able to address this as well, given the work that we had done on the Dayton peace negotiations together, there's going to be a push to treat it like both sides are equal, all sides are responsible, let's split the difference. But I'll come to that in a second. I think the important issues that are going to need to be resolved in order to put a stop to the Russian aggression in Ukraine and in its near abroad, and to deter future aggression, top of the list, accountability. Accountability for the atrocity crimes, war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide. We can cover that later in the roundtable if there's time. The second is the return of territory. Every state in the global community, including Ukraine, have a right to territorial integrity of their full territory. And so you're going to find a splicing of those territorial dimensions, okay? Mariupol and the territory around the Black Sea, okay, well, maybe the western part of the Donbass. No, this has to be a full return to Crimea, all of Donbass, and all of the most recently occupied territory. And that will be an issue that will be exceedingly difficult to negotiate, but I think is one of those tent stakes, so to speak, that are going to be necessary. And then reparations. States that are aggressors, that engaged in unprovoked conflict, need to pay, rebuild, engage in reparations to make Ukraine whole again. Now, clearly that's the Ukrainian position, but I'm taking this from the perspective of we're not looking to get to yes. We're not looking to split the difference. There's no real role for moral equivalency or accommodation or appeasement in this situation. In other conflicts, you roll in and you split the difference. You give a win-win. You make both sides happy. What is going to happen is what should be a clear negotiation to essentially reset the clock and move the Russians out of Ukraine is going to be clouded by a number of issues which the Russians will put on the table, such as, well, the right of self-determination. Donbass, the Crimea, don't they have some right of self-determination? They'll throw Kosovo in there as an example. They'll also talk about neutrality in the modern era. Shouldn't we have neutrality? They'll talk about disarmament. And this is what's going to be difficult. In a normal, not that there really are normal peace negotiations, sure, let's talk about self-determination. Let's talk about accountability. Let's talk about disarmament. Let's talk about reparations. But here, that will be a strategy of the Russians to win at the peace negotiation table what they were not, and so far have not been able to win militarily on the ground.
Thank you, Paul. You mentioned Kosovo, which is an excellent segue into my next question. I was going to ask Ambassador Alcalay about any parallels that you see between the Yugoslav wars and Russian invasion of Ukraine today, and what are some of the lessons learned from the Yugoslav conflict, the Yugoslav wars, that you can share with us today?
Thank you, Milena, for giving me the floor. I also would like to greet and condemn the other participants who gave me a broader view into the history of Ukraine, and Bogdan and Victor and Paul. So we in the UN, I don't know you are aware, we took a very firm position on aggression on Ukraine. As you know, the Security Council in the UN deals with international peace and security in the world. It's like and condemning the country that invaded other country. But we had a particular case here that one country, which is P5, has a veto, invaded, and the other independent country. So when it comes to condemning the invasion and everything else, the Russian Federation exercised the veto. So Security Council could not do much about in the like a normal position as because one of the P5 exercised the veto. So we been appalled here among the members, a large number of members of United Nations. We found something which is in the UN Charter, and that is we put the issue before the General Assembly. The UN Charter allows this by Article, I think it's 5 or 6, and well, so this is not, if you put before the General Assembly, that doesn't produce, I would say, overriding the veto, but it goes to what Paul was talking about, accountability, that whichever country exercise veto power in any case of breaching security and safety in the world, immediately the conclusion is that within the 10 days, President of General Assembly has to call General Assembly to debate, and all the countries will have the right to debate the issue, as we had for case of Ukraine. And that was used twice so far. First was condemning the aggression, where 141 countries voted and only 5 countries were against. Okay, we know which countries are those: Russia, Belarus, Syria, there are 2 more, Eritrea, and one more. So, and it's overwhelmingly. Second, this case exercising was in order to kick out the Russia from Human Rights Council. It would be such a, travesty if Russia is in the Human Rights Security Council of the United Nations and doing all these horrific crimes, killing and shelling civilians who live in Ukraine. And that brings me to the issue of Kosovo and the war in Balkans. Also, the civilians were a major target in both cases. We were witnessed the big, I would say, exodus of Kosovo Albanians. More than 1 million people were put on a move. They ended up in Macedonia, Northern Macedonia, and elsewhere. So eventually, after the NATO action, they were able, some of them were able to return. And for those who were Rambouillet, like Paul, they would talk much more about the negotiation, which proved not to be fully successful, but it still stopped the fighting. This situation in Bosnia-Herzegovina was similar to the way how the Milosevic regime attacked neighboring countries, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and using their proxy in Bosnia-Herzegovina in order to conquer the territory and to annihilate the other ethnic groups, actually to exercise a deal between Tudjman and Milosevic to divide and carve out Bosnia into two pieces that Croatia would take apart and Serbia would take apart. And they did this ethnic cleansing to annihilate the Bosnian Muslims out of the picture or create them in an enclave to be assimilated along the way. The big difference here that the world stood up, maybe learned the lessons from Bosnian War or something, that we were deprived of the arms. There was an arms embargo, imposed by former rump Yugoslavia on Bosnia-Herzegovina on all territory with the pretext that it's already too much arms and we don't want to pour oil to the fire. But in reality, there were many arms, but they were on the wrong side because those defenders didn't have any arm to defend themselves. So this arms embargo was totally unjust. And most of my time in Washington, I was fighting to lift the arms embargo. And we had the policy, Paul would remember, lift and strike. So that was something to do, and having NATO, which at the end happened, but it took 3.5 years. The siege of Sarajevo, and where more than thousands of civilians were killed and 1,601 children. So it's very, very similar in the war. As the worst case is the worst thing that can happen when such a neighboring countries who was in position taking Yugoslav army, which we all financed, to use for their own purposes. So totally unjustified. And we are now in the 72nd day of the Russian invasion. And as also my distinguished panelists say, we don't see the peace inside. We don't see the end where and what kind of end that would be. Again, another frozen conflict. But as Victor said, you never know. You're not clear with the Russians. They might use a pause to regroup and then reorganize, do inscription, who knows? And we are all waiting for this 9 May, which they created. What's going, because this is usually big parade. So we don't know. And then if you listen to the Lavrov's statement, which was appalling, for it looks that the Jews did Holocaust to themselves. So it's some things which are used in a gaining political goals and war goals. I'll stop there to have a listen to the other things, but I'm really open to the Q&As afterwards.
Thank you so much. Now, Victor, let me return to you. You recently wrote about the international response to the Russian invasion and to Russia's previous aggressions. How, in your view, has the West been an enabler of the Russian invasion, and what lessons can be learned to prevent such an aggression from happening again, both in Ukraine and elsewhere?
Yes, thank you very much. I've spoken precisely on this issue quite a number of times. Let me just summarize some of the conceptual observations, and then I'll get down to some specifics. One overarching deficiency that we have is we are basically not very interested and largely ignorant of certain historic patterns of behavior in a century of dealings between Washington and Moscow. There are repeating patterns, both on our side and Russian side, that we really don't pay attention to, or not enough attention. And that results in a loss of what I call predictive capacity. We don't have a very good a sense of wanting even to believe warnings that are not consistent with our perception of a certain situation. Very often we've lacked political will, and it's not just the United States, but the Western democracies generally. And we have been hugely susceptible to financial, economic, and political corruption by Russia. Of course, that's being shed with the sanctions, but that has been a common thread. And let me give you a bit of an overview on a more practical level. The first time that we went askew with Russia was at the very beginning with the fall of the Soviet Union, where we put Russia on its economic feet, essentially ensured that it was the sole economic and military legatee of the Soviet Union. And the country, which was Ukraine, when it reasserted its independence, that ensured the fall of the Soviet Union. We really didn't establish any kind of Marshall Plan or anything similar to ensure the ongoing viability of Ukraine, even though, as I say, Ukraine was the pivotal factor for the final fall of the Soviet Union. We never saw any acknowledgement or atonement by Moscow of the prior regime. And we really never had a good sense or an adequate sense of what truly was the heinous nature of the Soviet Union, so that when Putin, for example, started celebrating Stalin's birthday in 1999 and started reconstructing Soviet symbolism, it never made an impact on us. If we were to posit the following hypothetical, let's assume we have a emergent remilitarized Germany with a former Gestapo officer starting to celebrate Hitler and resurrecting the swastika, invading Denmark and the Netherlands on the argument that those are Germanic peoples or that Germany needs a buffer. I can assure you that that kind of behavior would not have lasted very, very long, and we wouldn't have tolerated the way we have tolerated Putin in Russia. The second factor that enters into this is a failure of deterrence credibility. We condemned behaviors, we didn't act accordingly. And what it amounted to in the long run, to really nothing more than appeasement. We had Chechnya, Moldova, Georgia, Ukraine in 2014. In all of these instances, none of the activity or actions that we took, none of the sanctions that we imposed even began to remotely approximate or be commensurate with the seriousness of the violations of international law and international agreements. I mentioned corruption earlier as well in that same context. When Alexander Litvinenko was poisoned with a miniature nuclear device, polonium, in London, 3 successive British prime ministers did absolutely nothing. We never did anything about the Litvinenko assassination for more than 10 years. And this is very, very symptomatic. That served as a provocation for us, a provocation, I should say, for Putin. For us, a provocation is not what a provocation is for Putin or indeed for Russia generally. When we try to not provoke, we are in fact provoking. And when we wind up what we think is a provocation for Putin, it's a red light. A concrete example I'll give you, in 2015 or so, we had a member of the National Security Council who wrote an article in the Washington Post arguing that we should not arm Ukraine because it would lead to escalation. Russia had escalatory dominance, it would be provocative. Well, the logical corollary of that argument is the less able a country is to defend itself, the safer it is. That's the necessary logical conclusion of that kind of argumentation. Now, fortunately, we have shed much of it, but remember that Western aid, military aid to Ukraine, really didn't start moving in any kind of significant volume or significance until after the 24 increased whole-scale invasion. It is really only then that we became serious with giving the weaponry that Ukraine needed. You can ask yourself the question, what if Ukraine had that in 2014 or afterwards? What would have happened if Georgia and Ukraine were NATO members? The odds are Russia would not have invaded either country. What do we do to prevent this from happening again? Well, unfortunately, agreements are really not very consequential, if at all, in dealing with Russia. That has simply been not the history. And in the first instance, we need credibility, we need credible strength. So does Ukraine, so does NATO, so do the other countries. Why have countries who were under Russia's boot, why did they all in the 90s practically beg for NATO membership? Because they've had experience with that. The other component here is we have an opportunity that we've never had before, which is to promote an evolution internally within Russia. We have to do what we can to turn Putin inward. And let's remember that what President Reagan called the evil empire, it really had three concentric circles. The outside circle was what we call Eastern Europe. The middle circle was what was the Soviet Union, 15 republics, Russia being the primary one, but really a reconstituted Tsarist empire. That dissolved, and of course, Putin is anxious to hammer that empire back in one form or the other. And then the inner circle is actually the Russian Federation itself. It is not one nation. The Russian faux federation really constitutes itself of a score and even more non-Russian nations. There's a tremendous amount of dissatisfaction and anger for a whole host of reasons. Some of them are economic, some of them are linguistic, some of them are ecological. And those tensions are building up within Russia itself. As I said earlier, a country that occupies an entire 1/3 of Asia and 40% of Europe. So you can only imagine the stresses and strains that exist. And I wouldn't be at all hesitant to use information as we did it during the Cold War and promote the very same ideas and values that the Western democracies hold dear and to promote them within Russia itself. One thing that we can consider, we just talked a little bit about the United Nations. Russia, let's remember, was never a member of the United Nations. It was kicked out of the Human Rights Council recently. But when the Soviet Union invaded Finland in 1939, the League of Nations kicked the Soviet Union out. So the question is, why don't we add to our arsenal? Why don't we add kicking Russia out of the United Nations? And we could very well ask ourselves as well, how is it that Russia acceded to the seat of the Soviet Union on the Security Council without following UN procedures and processes? Lithuania did to become a member of the UN. They had to apply. Ukraine always was a member of the UN, but Russia never was. I haven't jumped into that myself to examine it, but it appears that processes and procedures within the UN were never followed by Russia to become a member of the National Security Council. I may be wrong, but I don't think that I am. And it's something for us to consider just for starters. Bottom line, it's good to have agreements. They're helpful, they're necessary, but they are not determinative. Unfortunately, raw power still counts and is still paramount.
Thank you so much for that very comprehensive answer. Now, I wanted to turn to the topic of NATO next, and I'm going to ask this question of Ambassador Alcalay, who served as Bosnia-Herzegovina's ambassador to NATO from 2004 to 2007. Can you tell us a little bit more about the role of NATO, what role NATO may play in any possible resolution of this conflict, but also I want to combine this question with the question that just came in through the question and answer feature from one of our audience members, which is as follows. What do you say to those experts in the West who say that it was NATO expansion east that provoked Putin to invade Ukraine? So if you can talk a little bit about that assertion and then any possible positive role that NATO could play in the resolution of this conflict.
Let me try to answer on the second question first, because it's a resounding no, it didn't, because if NATO, being a member of NATO, is more deterrent than provoking one country to invade another. So no doubt that so many countries want to join NATO as a democratic alliance, political alliance, which is in their core, has this military wing, important for defense of members of alliance, and especially the Article 5 of Atlantic Charter, where attack on one country means attack on all countries. So I don't think that the expansion of NATO to east would provoke, in this case, Russia or Georgia, aggression on Georgia by the Russians, or let alone even Moldova with Transnistria, the occupied zone. So it was just, I believe, merely Putin's idea of restoring Tsar's Russia, to bring it to the old glory, because he came after Yeltsin. And during the Yeltsin time, we all recall, people were actually, Russia was on their knees. They were really bad conditions. The pensions were not there, and the people were really suffering, had to sell all their belongings and house. So in the Putin head from that time, he has idea to restore Russia to its glory, how it used to be. So he never let him know. So he will do this even the NATO didn't expand as it did. Although if Ukraine is a member of NATO, then it will be a big deterrent. I'll tell you one small example from Balkans war, because I have to draw always the parallel and things, what I say, history repeats itself. With Northern Macedonia was never attacked in the Balkans war. Why? There were only 300 peacekeepers in Northern Macedonia staying there, and Milosevic didn't dare to do anything to invade Macedonia. So I think deterrent, the NATO being an important deterrent for the countries who are smaller size, like our country, like most countries in the Western Balkans, and it's a great protection on this. So I think that it was not at all NATO policy to expand and to create the danger for Russia. That's one of the topics which they were mentioned. Oh yeah, the rockets are coming closer and everything. NATO in its core doesn't have policy of aggression invading other countries. Through developing democracy, which what Victor mentioned, I think it's a way for expand further east. And that's what Putin is afraid, because you see all the protests against the war and everything. You know what happened with these young people who had the guts and courage to go out and protest against the war. So democracy is the way to move forward. And I think NATO is bringing this kind of democracy besides protection of the country, which is a member of NATO. That's why Bosnia is still opting to become member of NATO. But then we have opposition by the local Bosnian Serbs not to join NATO because, oh, NATO bombarded the Serbs. NATO bombarded Milosevic thing, it was never used against the Serbs themselves, but as their aggressors in Bosnia-Herzegovina. So therefore, I think this discussion should be continued in a sense to bring countries closer and move in this democratic process further.
Thank you. Now, my next question is for Paul, following on a similar topic, similar theme. One document that gets mentioned a lot is the so-called Budapest Memorandum. Can you tell us a little bit more about that memo?
Yeah, Milena, thank you for asking that question, because I think this is an important historical context that is often mentioned, but the significance is overlooked. As Victor and Bohdan had mentioned, there's quite an initiative now to, little too late, to arm the Ukrainians. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Ukraine had the third largest nuclear stockpile in the globe. They were a major nuclear superpower. The United States, Russia, and the United Kingdom reached an agreement with Ukraine where Ukraine would join the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It would dismantle these weapons or transfer the launchers and some of the weapons back to Russia, and essentially become non-nuclear in exchange for a security guarantee that neither the United States, the United Kingdom, or Russia would threaten or use force against Ukraine. And I note that because you see exactly the opposite has happened. This is a situation where Ukraine, through deterrence, and this comes back to Victor's earlier point about if you make a state weak, that is the antithesis to deterrence and may in fact provoke conflict. Ukraine had a deterrent capability. The United States, the British, and the French, the United States, the British, and the Russians, in exchange for these security guarantees, rock hard guarantees, gave up its nuclear deterrence. So not only is there a violation of international law, I think there's a fairly clear moral obligation by the Americans, the British, our NATO allies, to provide the assistance, and more so, that we are doing with Ukraine at the moment.
Thanks, Paul. My next question is for Bohdan. You recently wrote about the nature of Russian war crimes that have been committed during the invasion. What are some of these crimes and how might they affect the prospects for a negotiated peace agreement?
Sure, thanks for that question. When we look at the elements of individual crimes as set forth by the International Criminal Court, we see that President Putin and some or all of Russia's political, military, and even religious leadership may be guilty of one or more of the types of crimes committed in connection with mass state-sponsored violence against a group. For example, the ICC lists 4 elements for the crime of genocide by killing. These are: the perpetrator killed or caused the killing of 1 or more persons. 2, such person or persons belong to a particular national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. 3, the perpetrator intended to destroy, in whole or in part, that national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. And 4th, the conduct took place in the context of a manifest pattern of similar conduct directed against that group. I think that the evidence that has been created thus far by the Russians themselves demonstrates that all 4 of those elements have been satisfied. Now, typically, the hardest element to prove in these kinds of cases is intent. What is extraordinary in this case is that Putin and the Russians have literally bragged about what they intended to do to Ukrainians. So, in contrast to other cases, intent really is not an issue. Let's just look at one other crime, the crime of crimes against humanity by murder. That crime has 3 elements. First, the perpetrator killed or caused to be killed 1 or more persons. Second, the conduct was committed as part of a widespread or systemic attack directed against the civilian population. And 3, the perpetrator knew that the conduct was part of, or intended the conduct to be part of, a widespread or systemic attack against the civilian population. Once again, I think that what Russia has done thus far has satisfied all of those elements. Now, courts such as the ICC can try individuals, but not countries, as was also the case at Nuremberg before the ICC was created. So potential defendants are Putin and his leadership, however realistic or unrealistic that may be. But when it comes to crimes such as genocide, there is also another court, the court of public opinion. And this court may both judge countries and individuals. The Yale professor of philosophy, Jason Stanley, has just posted a very interesting reflection on genocide that he titled The Genocidal Identity. For purposes of his analysis, he defines genocide more broadly than the UN Convention on Genocide did in 1948, which is still the operative definition, and incorporates some of Raphael Lemkin's thinking, Lemkin having been the inventor of the term genocide. Stanley suggests that the crime of genocide involves a proven attempt to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group, to erase all traces of it, culturally and physically. This objective is pursued through methods including mass murder, rape, kidnapping, involuntary abortion, and sterilization. While children may be re-educated to adopt an entirely new identity, their old culture will have been systematically erased from books and other media, the goal being to deny that their ancestors ever existed at all. Now, Stanley argues that in a situation in which large swaths of the population, as happened in Germany, support a genocidal project, then that country takes on a genocidal identity for generations to come. He fears that that is what is taking place in Russia. And he ends by writing that if Russia's genocide in Ukraine continues, and if the reconceptualization of Russianness succeeds, assertions of Russian identity will forever evoke not Pushkin or Tolstoy, but the enthusiastic extermination of an entire people. The deaths and atrocities that we have already seen in Bucha and elsewhere will become the ultimate expression of Russian identity. That is the choice, an identity bound up with a horrifying legacy that today's Russians are making for their descendants. That's a view that I share. And obviously that's a situation that greatly complicates the ability to reach any kind of an agreement.
Thank you so much. And my last question goes to Paul. Returning to this topic of peace negotiations, you have lectured extensively on the subject of negotiating justice. Within this context of war crimes committed by Russia, how does one approach this tension between peace and justice when trying to negotiate peace?
Yeah, thank you, Milena. Following up on Bohdan's comments, I think that it's important to recognize that the international community is going to need to be exceptionally clear-eyed about the nature of the atrocity crimes that have been committed against the Ukrainian people. And the Ukrainians, the friends of Ukraine, the international community need to guard against the instinct of negotiators to get to yes, to put justice for after the negotiations. Don't clutter my negotiations with these notions of justice. We just got to stop the war. We have to stop the killing. And there's value to that. But unless accountability and unless justice is woven into the peace process, this will not be the last conflict. This will be, as our colleagues have said at the beginning, a negotiation as part of an ongoing conflict. It's going to be exceedingly difficult, which is why it's so important for the International Criminal Court to be engaged. It's so important for organizations, and particularly the Ukrainian civil society, to be engaging in documentation. And the volume on the narrative of accountability is going to need to be tuned up to the maximum as, and at whatever point in time, one of the questioners said, peace negotiations, when? They always happen, not tomorrow, maybe 6 months, maybe a year, but when the parties move into a peace process, you're going to need to amplify these calls for accountability. Otherwise, it will not be a durable peace and it will not ensure deterrence.
Thank you so much, Paul. We will end on that note as we're running out of time. Thank you for joining us and submitting your questions. This webinar recording will be available on the PILPG website and also shared with all the attendees on Zoom via email. This event was part of the PILPG Thought Leadership Initiative series. Thank you very much to our panelists for taking the time today to talk about the recent developments in Ukraine and Russia and providing your analysis on the potential prospects for a negotiated peace. I encourage everyone to follow our Thought Leadership Initiative and join us for our next event on Friday, May 20th, where we will discuss the role of the United Nations in international peace and the war in Ukraine. Thank you so much for attending, and thank you to our panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you, Milena. It was a pleasure.
Take care.
Thank you.